Hi, this is the Tolkien Curmudgeon. I've been thinking how I'd like to discuss a little bit more about why does any of this matter, really, about the Rings of Power television series and its distortions of the lore. Some people seem to think, well, they bought the rights, so they have the right. They can do anything they please with it. I think something different. Anyway, more calmly than perhaps usual for me, I'd like to talk more about these issues. First of all, I'd like to say that I discussed in other videos of mine my approach to Tolkien's Legendarium, in which I considered the idea of thinking of his Legendarium as Niggle's Garden, as we understand it from his beautiful story, Leaf by Niggle. In that story, we understand that Niggle was a painter who painted leaves of trees and eventually began to make this one great landscape of one tree. It had some passages which were unfinished, but due to unfortunate circumstances, Niggle was never able to finish the painting. And in a kind of allegorical style, which Tolkien didn't usually write in, we have the idea of Niggle going on a journey, and that journey is actually death. And in the afterlife, he passes through a kind of purgation, a kind of purgatory. And in that purgatory, he meets his neighbor who disregarded his painting entirely during his life, but who now enters into the Garden of Niggle. And the garden has become a real place in this afterlife. Not an imaginary place, but a real place. And Niggle's neighbor is helping to cultivate it. Well, I tend to think that as Tolkien didn't finish his Legendarium, we are like Niggle's neighbor. We can enter that garden and help to cultivate it. Now, are we going to be bad gardeners who go in and uproot the things planted by the original designer and gardener, Tolkien himself? Are we going to try to cultivate this beautiful place in harmony with what he's already created? It's quite well known that Tolkien considered the idea of other minds and hands participating in his Legendarium. But again, I can hardly imagine that he would have been happy about some of the things that Amazon has been doing, which I think is not really a stretch to imagine if you read his reactions to the script by Zimmerman for a proposed animated version of The Lord of the Rings. Tolkien was quite offended by things in the plan that Zimmerman had made. Luckily, that film was never made. But now we've seen a series made which commits egregious changes. And I think changes quite similar to the ones that Tolkien said he'd be against. Anyway, you might say again something to the effect that why does it all matter? It's just an imaginary world. It's not real. And I'd say that, well, I think Tolkien was one of the last great inheritors of the Romantic tradition, really. And let's go back more to the beginning. How about John Keats? Certainly, John Keats is still very important to this day, and well do I remember taking some introductory literature courses in the university where we were reading John Keats and had to write, maybe cut our teeth on writing literary analysis by reading John Keats and explicating his poetry. Well, I think in the very famous poem by Keats on first looking into Chapman's Homer, we can get a kind of a key to understanding what it is like for the Romantic mind to conceive of these vast imaginary worlds as almost real places. And when we enter them, I think we'll find Tolkien there. And we shouldn't be ejecting him from these realms of gold and these goodly states and kingdoms that we have seen. So that leads into the poem. On first looking into Chapman's Homer, which of course meant Chapman's translation of Homer, and don't forget that in those days, all English schoolboys had to study Greek and Latin and translate things like Homer into English. And imagine probably having read Homer in Greek, feeling, however, that you really got to understand it when you read a particularly great translation of it. Well, anyway, let's read the poem. Much have I travelled in the realms of gold, and many goodly states and kingdoms seen. Round many western islands have I been, which bards and fealty to Apollo hold. Oft of one wide expanse had I been told, that deep-browed Homer ruled as his demesne. Yet never did I breathe its pure serene, till I heard Chapman speak out loud and bold. Then felt I like some watcher of the skies, when a new planet swims into his ken, or like stout Cortez, when with eagle eyes he stared at the Pacific, and all his men looked at each other with a wild surmise, silent upon a peak in Darien. And so, as I've said, reading Tolkien is like traveling in those Western Isles and seeing the goodly kingdoms and being in the realms of gold. And it's only in the mind, but it seems like something real. And we can not only share it with Tolkien, but with each other. And if we create many different contradictory visions, it becomes harder and harder for us to share really a kind of communion among us of shared traveling through these wonderful realms. So it's a very sad thing for some people with tremendous amounts of cash provided by the richest man in the world from one of the largest corporations to come in and spread their particular vision to many, many, many. We're all entitled to imagine it as we wish. You can even write fan fiction if you want to. But to have $1 billion to turn your fan fiction into a TV series, which is then peddled to people around the world, most of whom have never and will never read the Silmarillion or the history of Middle-earth or any of these things. And it will replace those things in their minds. And I find that terribly sad. Thank you for listening.